Welcome to another episode of the Breaking Methods webinar series. I'm Ash Watson, a sociologist and postdoctoral fellow with the Vitalities Lab at UNSW. I research digital technologies and I work with qualitative and creative research methods. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about zines and some of the ways that you can use zine making in social research. Zine making is a great method for people who want to bring a relatively inexpensive, hands-on and participatory activity into qualitative projects. In this webinar, I'm going to overview some of the things to consider if you want to use zines in your research and explain how I have used zine making in some recent workshops of my own. A zine is an independent publication of writing, photography, collage, and other kinds of creative work. Zines are usually photocopied in a small run and are often fully handmade or feature handmade elements. So even if the content has been made on a computer, they are often still hand folded and stapled, or for example, the binding might be hand sewn. If you're interested in getting your hands on some zines, the best place to do so is at a zine fair, though lots of people also sell zines online using platforms like Etsy. There are also a number of online zine archives where you can easily read zines that have been digitized. The contemporary form has its roots in punk subculture, so in many ways that align with this tradition, a zine is actually often understood by what it is not. Zines are not made for profit, and in fact, zine makers often run at a loss. They are anti-mainstream and countercultural, both in terms of the kinds of topics they feature and how they stand against mainstream print publishing and online digital publishing. And they are anti-acclaim in that they resist the markers and standards of quality that other comparable creative works have. Zines are also a very DIY form. Anyone can make a zine with a piece of paper and a pen. This is a literal feature as well as an ethos and a kind of political orientation that is really at the heart of zine cultures and is relevant to the value of zine making within the context of social research. I think the best way to use zine making in a social research project is to use it as an activity within an interview, a focus group, or an interactive workshop. This could be as an individual or a collaborative exercise, so involving people making their own personal zines or involving people making one zine together. I approach zine making as a creative focusing activity, so it's something hands-on and generative to do with participants while you're talking about the issues and topics of your research. While you're talking to people about their experiences, they are also working to represent those experiences in their zines. This might make up one part of an interview or a workshop rather than the whole time, so structure your sessions in whatever way will help you best address your research questions. This is just one way to use zine making as a method. You could also host focus groups online using video calling software and either send making materials in advance or reimburse participants for materials that they source themselves. You could also use zines in an asynchronous approach, where, for example, participants make a zine at home and send it to the researcher digitally or via the post. This may be a better process in contexts where doing in-person research is difficult for whatever reason. In any of these approaches, it will be important to consider how to analyze the zine artifacts themselves, as well as any discussion you might have also recorded. You might be more familiar with the qualitative analysis of interview transcripts, but as I'll talk about later, it will also be important to consider some visual and textual analysis techniques. Methodologically, within the broader landscape of social research, the uptake of zine making sits within the turn towards participatory and creative methods. This turn is all about doing research with rather than about participants, and as a result, rather than data collection, the focus is on data production. This is similar to the approach in some innovative qualitative and post-qualitative work, where a hybrid form of creative practice brings together art and social science for research creation. If you're interested in creative methods as a researcher, you likely already see and understand the value they can bring, for example, in shifting and opening up some of those focus group dynamics between participants and with the researcher. It's important to remember, though, that participants can be hesitant to engage in creative activities, especially if they feel pressure to create something that is quote-unquote good in a normative artistic sense. Being asked to be creative can make lots of people feel stressed or unsure, or pressured to make something that you as a researcher will want, rather than something creative they themselves have been moved to make. This isn't only an issue when you're using creative methods. You can have this with a more standard interview too, of course, when people are trying to be helpful and give you answers they think you're looking for. This is one reason I found zine making to be a really generative creative method. Unlike lots of other artistic forms, the zine medium is intentionally handmade, DIY, scrappy, and imperfect. People don't have to do one kind of thing. If they don't want to write, they can cut out words from a magazine. If they don't want to draw, they can reappropriate given images. And if they don't know what to say, they don't have to use words at all to say anything. They can represent more complex and harder to articulate feelings or experiences using visual materials. To prepare for a zine making activity, you'll need to have ready a range of materials that will let people cut, paste, draw, write, and collage. Having a range of magazines is always useful, and you can often get old magazines for free or much cheaper from places that sell these if you find out when they get their new stock. It can also be useful to have some selected materials that are relevant to your research topic, so brochures, images, or text that you've typed up and printed in advance. A little trick I like to use to get people interacting is that I don't provide one pair of scissors and one glue stick per person. I have fewer things out, so people need to get creative with, for example, ripping paper, and so that people need to share the tools and interact. You will also need time. I've done zine workshops lasting 1 hour and others lasting over 4 hours, and in both kinds I've never felt like I've had too much time. In my experience, 2 hours is really ideal, so the people involved can get to know each other a little and make sense of the activity before they settle into it, and so that you're not rushing to just produce the product. This activity is really all about the dialogue that making a zine can help stimulate, while you're making it, in the zine itself, and at the end when you're looking at what's been made. Once people have finished making their zine and you can look and talk about what people have made and why, some really valuable discussion happens. So you want to allow time and the right kind of pace for this to be able to happen. You will also need somewhere to work. The photo on the slide here is an example from the algorithmic micropolitics workshop that I'm going to discuss in a moment. When setting up a space like this, some things to consider include having enough elbow room to work, as well as having some space for quiet and privacy, so people can create without feeling like they're being watched over their shoulder. And if you're in a group setting, having a setup where people can face each other and talk as a group is also really beneficial. You will also need your more standard qualitative tools and techniques, like audio or video recorders and perhaps a scanner to make a record of the zines after the session. In terms of process within a session, have your materials prepared in advance in the room. It's always really useful to have a variety of examples of zines on hand, so people can see what a zine is when you explain it to them. It can also be useful to have instructions prepared in text and perhaps in video for people to check their page folding, layout, and so on. There are hundreds of instructional guides online for all different sizes and kinds of zines, so I recommend spending some time finding a guide that is best suited for what you want to do. Be really clear about what you expect, so participants have some direction about what to do and why they are doing it. Explain why you're using zines and how this kind of creative representation adds to your project. Also be clear about timing, when people want to be finished making by. Remind people that this is earlier than the formal session end, so that you have that time to look at the zines and talk about the zine making process. I recommend that you join in with your participants, so you're sitting at the table and cutting and pasting and talking too, rather than observing from the sideline. In my experience, doing this cultivates a really nice dynamic, and if you've brought examples of zines, participants can use those as a guide if they'd like one, rather than trying to emulate whatever you are doing. Zine making is something that you can really get lost in. It's both mindful and mindless at once, so it is important that you mark time along the way. Let people know when you want everything to be finished and remind them as you go. Half an hour left, 10 minutes left, and so on. So people who really do submerge in the process don't feel surprised when it's the end, and don't feel rushed or stressed to finish something. If people finish their zine or their page early, you can encourage them to keep going and make as much as they like. How I manage expectations of quantity is I set minimums. So if I'm doing an individual zine, I ask that everyone makes at least one mini zine each. If I'm doing a collaborative zine, I ask that everyone is responsible for contributing at least one page each. People may make their pages together, but putting each person in charge of one page is how I try to keep an even pace and a balance. It's really good to rotate materials throughout the session if people aren't actively doing this between themselves. You may also find that there are cycles of discussion and then quiet work. I try to encourage discussion if people really settle into silence, but remember that you have a built-in discussion time at the end, so don't worry if people aren't overly chatty while they are working. In saying that, I have found that with too much time and not enough discussion and interaction, people can try to produce something they think is perfect, that they're really happy with and is finished. With zines, though, I often find that trying to do that is a bit beside the point, so encourage people to reach the point where they find their page is good enough for them to speak to and explain what they're trying to do. For many participants, this will likely be the moment when you ask them to stop. When you've reached the end of the making part of the session, I like to lay out all of the finished zines or pages somewhere in the room where everyone can see them or walk through them. This is usually on a spare table or on the ground somewhere, because the main table is usually a huge mess at this point. Give people some time to take the pages in, to read them and hold them quietly. Then I like to encourage sharing. You might like to sit back down for this with people picking up their zine or pages, or you can do it standing around where you've laid them out. First, I find it useful to get people to do a show and tell with what they've made, to explain why they did what they did, and then encourage reflections or comments and questions from the group. Once you've been around everyone, it's really valuable to then have a longer open discussion where you iteratively use some of the key themes people raised when sharing the zines they've made that is focused on the issues you are researching. In my experience, by using zine making in this way, you can often dive deeply, more quickly, into those complex and intimate connections between social issues and people's experiences, because the group have shared in the activity and shared a part of themselves through their zine. A few hot tips from my own experience. Leave the photocopying for later. Photocopying zines actually takes a bit of time to get used to, with the multiple and flipped pages, and trying to do this quickly while people are waiting for you can get very stressful. If you're doing a collaborative zine, something I like to do rather than getting people have their name on their individual page is to have a contributor page if you have consent for people to include names, or I get people to name the backs of their pages. Finally, people really do like to have a copy of what they've made, so make sure you get the required information from your participants to return their original or a copy of the zine if they would like one. I want to give two examples of zine workshops I've recently led to show you some different topics and projects where zines have been a useful research activity. The first was algorithmic micropolitics. This was a creative methods workshop involving 6 attendees who made a collaborative zine on the effective encounters they had with data, digital technologies, and the power of algorithms. This was one of a series of creative methods workshops convened as part of a bigger project called Living with Personal Data, Australians' Understandings and Practices, which is led by Deborah Lupton and Mike Michael and funded by the Australian Research Council. This explores how people make sense of and with their personal data generating devices. Early on in this project, before we commenced data collection with our participants, we used this zine making workshop as an experimental event to assess the collaborative ways that participants iteratively create throughout a session. You can read more about these workshops in this article we've recently published in Qualitative Research. In a similar way to a pilot study, as well as sharing our methods via a hands-on workshop, we used this to test and get some reflexive feedback on our approach before we undertook our participant workshops. Following this, we tinkered with the prompts and our ways of framing personal data issues that are central to the generative activities. So the aim was to use zine making to think about and do different explorations of the felt presence of algorithms in everyday life. We drew on zine making as a tactile, hands-on, and collaborative method to challenge and disrupt some of the common ways of imagining the impact of algorithms as only screen-based and individual in nature. The workshop practically explored zine making as a lively activity for thinking with and against digital technologies and data, for considering what Tanya Bucher calls the felt presence of algorithms in everyday life. To initiate discussion before moving to the hands-on zine making, I prompted attendees to consider Booch's question: when do people encounter algorithms, and what responses and imaginations do these encounters generate? We talked about this question, and then people did some initial writing, mapping, and sketching in response. I then introduced Deborah Lupton's work on what personal data assemblages allow bodies to do and how they come to matter in people's lives. I used this idea as a linked provocation to transition the workshop into the making component. Working with paper, magazines, excerpts from Booch's and Lupton's work, and the initial writing and mapping they completed, attendees experimented with collaging, creative writing, illustration, and layering text and pictures to query and think through some of the ways that they feel algorithmic processing in everyday life. At the end, when looking at the final zine, the discussion focused on the shared and novel experiences people had captured in their zine pages. For instance, patterns of targeted advertising and the changing curation of, for example, the Explore page on Instagram. The second example was a zine workshop I ran for a project titled Understanding Youth Mental Health and Addictions, A Broken Dialogue. This is a project by the Black Dog Institute funded by the Sydney Partnership for Health Education Research and Enterprise, led by Catherine Boydell, Jill Bennett, Julia Lappin, and Janet Parsons, with 7 citizen scientists who are mostly in their teens and early 20s. This project uses the brokered dialogue method to explore the intersections of the different views on mental health and drug and alcohol use. After the preliminary work had been done by the team to identify the core areas of importance for their study, they held an official project launch where everyone involved gathered together for a few hours to identify what matters most to young people and center the views, knowledge, and experience of their citizen scientists. The team first held an introductory discussion going over the project methods and aims. Following this, I facilitated a zine workshop, where everyone firstly made an individual mini-zine for about 30 minutes and then together made a collaborative zine for about another 30 minutes. Based on the team's aims for this project launch, with the mini-zine I asked people to use it to reintroduce themselves to the group and reflect on why they were there. Then, with the collaborative zine, I asked people to reflect on how they wanted to frame the conversation about youth mental health and addiction, and who they thought should have a voice in the conversation. The participants talked during their zine making, and when finished, took a show and tell approach to sharing their personal zines and the pages they made for the collaborative zine. Something particularly noticeable that the zine making allowed in this context was multiple meaning. So participants crafted images that, for example, showed home as a safe and an unsafe place at once, a vehicle for both support and isolation. The lack of expectation to formulate a coherent narrative about themselves, or some very confident, concrete suggestions for the project, also allowed the participants to share their experiences and feelings in different ways, structured by the creative zine-making process and what became meaningful and relevant for them through this, rather than a more neatly formulated or linear fashion. The team used these zines to orient the next stages of the project and hone in their focus on those meaningful topics and issues that they explored in the zines. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, if you are using zine making as a creative and generative activity within a qualitative project, it's important to think about how you might analyze the zines as well as any recordings or transcripts you have. Zines are a hybrid textual and visual medium, so you want to attend to the layered materialities of the form in your analysis and how these elements relate to your research questions and aims. Focusing on the substance and form of the zine, you might take a content, narrative, or thematic analysis approach while also drawing on visual analytic approaches to composition and representation. If you're using a post-qualitative approach in your project, however, you want to be thinking about the more than representational elements of the zines, those sensory and affective qualities. While analysing the zines themselves as material artifacts, you can also draw on your participants' own explanations and experiences in your analysis. There are some really great projects happening at the moment using zine making as a method, which I want to highlight quickly here. Amanda Ptolemy is currently doing her PhD at the University of Glasgow using zine making as a feminist participatory research method to illuminate new understandings about the lives of disabled young women. Amanda has some great papers and blog posts where she explores related issues like positionality, agency, and a feminist ethics of care. Nicole Molyneux is also currently doing her PhD using zine making methods at the Australian National University. Nicole's project explores feminism as everyday practice, and she has a recent article out called Feminist Ways of Seeing the Radical Potential of Zines. Hoopt and colleagues' research uses zine making as an art therapy method to create anti-memoirs with older adults living in nursing homes. There are also quite a few learning and teaching articles where people talk about the value of using zine making in the classroom. Alison Pipemeyer's work is a real standout here for me. Finally, here are a couple of books that I found really useful across these zine making projects, and the information about the paper I recently published with Deborah Lupton, where we talk about the Algorithmic Micropolitics Zine Workshop. Thanks so much for listening.